Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about Abraham Lincoln and how he's so different from Donald Trump. Because Trump tries to compare himself to the greatest American presidents. Some of his supporters have been saying that his image ought to be etched onto the face of Mount Rushmore. In case you don't know, that's a cliff face in the United States. I think it's in Wyoming, where the faces of 4 presidents are carved into the rock, a project that began in the 1930s. Perhaps more suitable if his porcine features were carved into the rock face at Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is honoring the Confederate leaders, President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee, because he's a great admirer of theirs. He's an outspoken advocate of white nationalism, to put it mildly, if not white supremacy. And he refuses to rename U.S. Army bases, which are named in honor of Confederate generals, as in people who fought against the United States, traitors to the United States, people who took an oath to serve in the U.S. Army to defend the United States from enemies, foreign and domestic, and yet turned their hand against the United States. Anyway, so the contrast between Lincoln and Trump could scarcely be greater. Okay, they're both white American males, but really there the similarity ends. Okay, Lincoln was a Christian, but he's not someone who's very vocal about his faith. Certainly wasn't a Pharisee about it. Lincoln, who's famously born in a log cabin in Kentucky in unfavorable circumstances, and many Americans in the 19th century would boast that their country was so egalitarian that someone could rise from a log cabin to the White House, so you didn't have to be wealthy at all. Someone who grew up in these unpromising circumstances could ascend to the highest office in the land, and in most European countries that was unimaginable. They were monarchies at the time, and even to be prime minister, well, no way, you needed to be from an upper class family. So Lincoln's father was from Virginia, which of course was the linchpin of the Confederacy, and Abraham Lincoln, he later married the daughter of a slaveholder, but he decided that slavery was an abomination and it to be abolished. He wasn't that hard line amongst the abolitionist community, believing that it was a state issue and he would lead up to each state to abolish for themselves. So Lincoln was a man who measured his words, who was placid, who was reflective, a voracious reader, largely autodidactic, really all the things that Trump isn't. Anyway, obviously, so Lincoln was a lawyer in Illinois, and it's really after him, an increasing number of American presidents were lawyers. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln was a man of principle. He could be pragmatic too when he needed to, noted for his intelligence, his oracy, his celebrated Gettysburg Address, which is a fabulous example of brevity and eloquence, and echoes down the centuries, is admired and emulated all around the globe. The man who saved the Union, whereas Trump has done so much to divide Americans, to set them at each other's throats, who will imperil the Union, not so much in the geographical sense, but to some extent the racial sense, or to have 2 hostile camps, who thrives upon what's called a strategy of tension. Like, in France, when Chirac was calling some people a racaille, which had racial overtones as well. Now, Lincoln was a man of his era. He wasn't fantastic on racism, though he wanted to abolish slavery. He still wasn't into racial equality and disliked interracial marriage. But Trump, by the standards of this era, he's bad. Yes, he has appointed some black people to higher positions. I actually don't think Trump is racist against African Americans. He's willing to appeal to racist sentiment when it advances interests. He was willing to discriminate against them in housing in the 70s. That was just because there was money in it. Probably discriminate against whites if he made money out of it. Because, it would kind of overestimate him to suggest he was a racist, because that would suggest he actually believes in something. Anyway, so Lincoln once saw a man sold at auction, and it struck him as profoundly wrong that a member of our own species could be sold as chattel. Now, Trump wouldn't be like that because he really has no empathy. There was this fascinating study in the Atlantic magazine recently showing that the mightier you get, the less you're able to identify with other people, to read faces. You lose your emotional intelligence, and you're unwilling to consider alternative perspectives. It was engrossing and actually very telling, that piece. It reminds me of what Tory whips used to say in the United Kingdom, that no Prime Minister leaves Downing Street entirely sane. Downing Street being the official residence of the British Prime Minister, that it goes to their head. Now, to adapt Lord Acton's dictum, well, power tends to rot the mind. Maybe not the intellect so much, but emotional intelligence, some sense of judgment, detachment, objectivity. Trump had precious little of these to begin with. He's experiencing mental declension, pre-Alzheimer's, and obviously his ascension to the Supreme Office has simply accelerated these trends. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose him. This is just conjecture as a layman. Anyway, Lincoln was better than many in terms of opposing racism, but yeah, far from ideal, certainly by 21st century standards. Lincoln was a great fan of Richard III, that Shakespeare play, not of the monarch himself. Whereas the Confederates, they said, oh, well, he is Richard III, because Richard III was meant to be like a study in tyranny, just wrongful government, or he looked a bit odd. Lincoln probably had Marfan syndrome, which is why he was so incredibly tall, and had these oddly angular features which lent him a Diabolonian air. And they often said that he was a satanic Confederates. There's this famous line in Richard III which gave comfort to the Confederacy, where Richard III says, "A bard of Ireland told me once I should not live long when I saw Richmond," as in the Irish bard saying that once you see Richmond, you will die quite soon. But by then they're not talking about the town Richmond. They're talking about the Earl of Richmond. The Earl of Richmond is Henry VII, because before he became king, his title was Earl of Richmond, not King Henry VII. And indeed, in the battle, he sees Henry VII, and a minute later, Richard III is killed. But applying that to an American situation, that not long after Abraham Lincoln got to Richmond, Virginia, he would be killed. I'm not sure he ever actually visited Richmond, Virginia, but okay, the Civil War was over. His troops finally got to Richmond, taken them 4 years to go about 150 miles, and obviously days after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Forgive me if I misaccentuated that. But John Wilkes Booth, that Shakespearean actor, assassinated him in April 1865, shooting in the back of the head, and then leaping to the stage and saying, "Sic semper ad tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, being the motto of Virginia. But and some people were laughing very hard, thinking it was a skit. It was simply part of the show. Anyway, so it was what a way for John Wilkes Booth to go out. He was later killed in a shootout, wasn't apprehended, but his Confederates were, I mean, as in this conspiracy, not Confederates as in CSA, but yes, they were supporters of that Confederacy too, were caught and hanged, including Mary Surratt. You can see a fabulous film about that. But Booth escaped the date with a noose by being killed by the army in gunfire. So Trump is obviously very different, lacking the man's talents or any moral pole star, his modesty, his self-effacement, his disinterested service of the public, his steeliness when it came to the war, and he needed metal to push things through, being goal-oriented, having concentration, willing to be popular, and not appealing to people's worst sentiments. So these two are very different indeed. Once he was assassinated, it was his Vice President Johnson who said, "Now he belongs to the ages." And indeed he does, one of the most celebrated American presidents who saved the Union and ended servitude. Obviously, the United States still has some way to go on racial equality. Well, that's just some unconnected thoughts from me. So please give me a like. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I urgently need donations to sustain this channel. I translate from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, and Russian. I'll be a tour guide in London whenever tourism reopens. Obviously, I teach people online all sorts of subjects: history, politics, religious studies, French, law, things of that nature. Right, toodaloo.